So I'm going to talk a bit about the Clements itself and some of the resources we have. And bear with me while I minimize this, if I can. Nope. There we go. And then my colleague, Cheney Schopieray, is going to talk about some of our manuscript holdings. So here we go. Here's my slideshow. There we are. So William Clements Library. What is it? Who is William Clements? The Clements Library was founded here at the University of Michigan. We opened in 1923, so our centennial is coming up. And it is a research library of early American history. Our collections mostly go up to 1900, although we do go a little bit past that. Oh, that's not what I want to do. Do I use the arrow keys? There we go. So here's William Clements. William Clements was born in Ann Arbor. He attended the University of Michigan. He was an engineering major. And after he graduated, he moved to Bay City to work for the Bay City Industrial Works. He rose through the company, became the president, became a regent of the University of Michigan. For those of you who do not know what the Bay City Industrial Works did, they built big industrial machines like these. Steam shovels, cranes, excavators, mostly things that were carried on railroad carriages. If you've been to Greenfield Village, and I'm sure many of you have been, the big steam shovel that's outside the roundhouse from the Detroit Tunnel Company was built by the Bay City Industrial Works. Their steam shovels were used to dig the tunnels for the New York City subway system. And the thing that made him very wealthy was getting the contract for the steam shovels to dig the Panama Canal. So, wealthy industrialist living in Bay City. And in the late 19th century, he started collecting books. There was a circle of bibliophiles in Bay City. He got to know some of them and got more serious about book collecting, and his interests really focused on the history of European exploration and conquest in North America and the early history of the United States. So he built what was a really wonderful collection of books. He traveled to England and elsewhere in Europe. He had sort of an agent who introduced him to dealers and other collectors and built this marvelous collection. He had excellent taste, and he had enough money to act on that excellent taste. And in 1921, he said he decided to give his collection to the University of Michigan. He felt that a great university needed a great library of early Americana, like many of the big universities on the East Coast. And so he donated his collection to the university along with money to build the library building, which you're going to get to see a little bit later. The building was designed by Albert Kahn, and here you see the building under construction. And it opened in 1923, as I mentioned. So 1923, Mr. Clements goes back home, and he said, my career as a collector is done. I've assembled this great collection. I've given it to my alma mater. I'm sure many of you know collectors never trust a collector when they say that their career as a collector is done. Luckily for us, his was not. So he donated his collection of books, and then the agent who he'd been working with said, there are a lot of old aristocratic families in England, these big houses, kind of Downton Abbey type places, who are hard up, and they would be happy to talk to you about some of the things that they have in their collections. And so he began collecting manuscripts, especially related to the history of the Revolution. And he was able to purchase the papers of two of the British commanding generals for North America during the period of the Revolution, Thomas Gage and Henry Clinton. Collections that would be impossible to buy now, both because of cost and because Britain would not let them leave the country. So as a result, the Clements is now the best place in the United States to study the British side of the Revolution because of these manuscript collections. And here you see people sitting on chests of this is Gage, right, Cheney? All the chests look the same in these old pictures. So they're sitting on chests that the Gage papers came in. Many of these had not been opened since the 1780s. So it's this incredibly exciting moment for the history of the Revolution. We no longer sit on the collections. if you're expecting that from your visit later today. I'm sorry to disappoint you. So now we are a research library. We're open to students and faculty from the university, people we award research fellowships to, scholars from around the state and around the world. And there's Cheney up on the ladder in our manuscript stacks. We're a closed stack research library, so people come and request what they want, and we bring materials out to them. And the collection has continued to grow over time, and we've expanded out from the original scope of the materials, and I'll show you a bit of what I'm talking about. But thanks to Mr. Clements' vision and his generosity and subsequent generations of donors, the Clements Library is a tremendous resource for the study of pre-1900 American history. It is open to everybody. It matters a great deal to me that it's at a public university. Anybody can come use it. And so really encourage any of you who have interests in this area to make use of the collection and come see what we have. We also have an in-house conservation department. So, things that we get in are 250, 300 years old. We make sure that they're stable and able to be used by scholars. We have an active digitization program. That's a big part of how we make materials available and accessible to the public. Thanks to Cheney's great work, we got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to digitize the Gage papers, so we are just about to start that work. So hopefully in a few years, anybody anywhere will be able to access the Gage papers. The Clements Collection is divided into 4 divisions. So we have a map division, manuscripts, Cheney is the curator of manuscripts, graphic arts, and printed books. So that's how we think of our collection, and material sort of falls into one of those 4 areas. And these are just some examples, mostly things from Mr. Clements' original collection. So this is the kind of thing that he was interested in collecting in the late 19th century, sort of landmark works related to exploration of the Americas. So Champlain's map, famous map from 1613. This is our copy of the Wampanoag Bible, the first complete Bible printed in what's now the United States, printed in Cambridge on the Harvard campus. Our copy belonged to Samson Occam, who was the most famous Native American minister in 18th century New England, so another wonderful treasure of the collection. Everybody has seen this image many times, I'm sure. This is our copy of Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. Wonderfully hand-colored. Here's a letter from the Gage papers. This is sort of the thing that starts the American Revolution. Thomas Gage sends troops to Concord to seize the arms that the colonists have been collecting there. So these are the kinds of things that sort of were part of the early core collections of the Clements Library. We also have collections that have been added later, and I'm going to talk a bit in a moment about the Grimke papers. This absolutely nightmarish cross-writing in the 19th century. It's really hard to read. But we have the Theodore Dwight Weld and Grimke sisters papers, the collection of some of the most important abolitionists of the 19th century. This collection arrived at the library mostly in 1939. Our graphic arts collection has wonderful resources. Some of you may have seen our online exhibit on Native American photography. Here's a photograph of 5 Ojibwe men from Minnesota in the 1880s that's in that online exhibit. If you haven't looked at it, I really encourage you to have a look. It's about Native Americans in the Midwest, drawing from a recently acquired collection of photographs. And as I said, we're always adding to the collection, and I'm glad Angela mentioned the Detroit River. This is something that we purchased just this summer, a manuscript map of Fort Detroit from 1761. And there's the river, and there's this map was sold in 1967 and went into private hands, and nobody really knew where it had gone. So we were excited when we had a chance to acquire it this past year. So we're always adding to the collections. But our collections also have always focused on African American history. So here is a copy of the 1848 edition of Frederick Douglass's narrative. Cheney is going to be talking a bit more about Frederick Douglass in relation to our collections. one of the great landmarks of 19th century life writing and literature. We also have, more directly related to the interests of the group today, some of the things that you would expect a Library of Americana to have. So the narrative of Sojourner Truth, published in 1850 in Boston, again, one of the most important figures of 19th century abolitionism. This is the book that she talked about for most of her career as a lecturer. So we will have this out for you to see when you visit the library. But we also have narratives that are from abolitionists who are maybe a bit less well known, and I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with Laura Smith Haviland. You know much more about her than I do, I'm sure. This is a copy of her memoir, A Woman's Life Work, and there's the frontispiece. But what's interesting to me, and what I think is a way that the Clements can be of particular value to researchers working in this field. So you all know about Haviland's career, her work in anti-slavery, her work with the Underground Railroad. This is a memorial edition that's published after she died. This is 1902. And that cross and crown on the cover means a lot. So as I'm sure you know, she was raised a Quaker, fell out with the Quaker community in Michigan, and became a Methodist. So the cross and crown is the logo of the United Methodist Church in the early 20th century. And this is a very specific message saying, it's in the conversation about who gets the credit for the abolitionist movement and for the Underground Railroad. And this is, I think, a very intentional gesture saying, not a Quaker. She was a Methodist. And so the Clements has, well, we don't have papers from Laura Haviland. We have a lot of material about the schism within the Society of Friends in the 19th century and about different religious groups' involvement in abolitionism. So that's sort of some of the contextual resources that the Clements can bring to the research in this area. We also have narratives by escaped slaves who are maybe less well known. So John Brown escaped from slavery in Georgia, winds up in Canada working as a carpenter, and then moves to England where he supports himself as a carpenter for the rest of his life. He's not one of the, he's not Frederick Douglass, he's not Sojourner Truth, but this was a book that circulated widely in abolitionist and anti-slavery circles and has great detail about the work that the Underground Railroad did to get him from Georgia eventually to Canada and then overseas. Many of you may well be familiar with this book, Jermaine Logan, his narrative from Syracuse in 1859. He's a Methodist minister instrumental in the Jerry Rescue, one of the signal sort of acts against the fugitive slave law. He wrote letters in Syracuse newspapers after this comes out saying what he was doing. So in Syracuse, the Underground Railroad wasn't a secret. He was writing about the work that he and his family were doing to help people escape to Canada. After he publishes this book, his former mistress from the South wrote him a letter saying, you owe me $1,000 because you stole a horse when you left and you stole yourself, and I've fallen on hard times, so please send me $1,000. And he writes back to her, and the letter is published in The Liberator. And if you haven't read that letter, it's fantastic. And it's as outraged and as indignant as you would expect. But he also says, the Fugitive Slave Act has been nullified in Syracuse, so you want to arrest me, give it a shot. And so and we have a good run of The Liberator, so we would have that letter. And it gives you a sense of sort of the different contours of how the Underground Railroad operated in different parts of the country, and what was possible in Western New York was not possible in Ohio, for instance. I put this up purely for personal reasons. This is Anti-Slavery Reminiscences by Elizabeth Buffum Chase from a wealthy Quaker family in Rhode Island, active on the Underground Railroad. It's a pretty short pamphlet about her life and her experiences in the anti-slavery cause, published in Central Falls, Rhode Island. So she writes a lot about how people got to New England and then got to her family and the work that they did to get them farther north into New England, put them on the railroad to Worcester, Massachusetts, and then switched to the train to Vermont and sent them to Vermont and then up into Canada. So we don't have papers from Elizabeth Chase, but we've got a lot of stuff about railroads in New England. We have railroad timetables, and we have wonderful maps. So when she's talking about how people came from New Bedford to Providence to where she lived in Valley Falls and then up the Blackstone Valley, we have resources that can help you visualize that. And this is cheating. This map is not in the library. We don't have this detailed atlas of Rhode Island. So I put this up here because her book was published by a printer who was, I realize the resolution on this is not great. The printer was there. I lived here for 9 years. So, and her house was just up past that bend in the river. So it gives you a sense of how small some of these communities were and how close together things were, and just sort of the physical nature of how the Underground Railroad functioned. So in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of go quickly through this. I'm sure you all know William Still and his famous history of the Underground Railroad. To me, he's one of the sort of under-recognized heroes of 19th century American history. Thursday is the 200th anniversary of his birth. So there's a conference in Philadelphia about his life and legacy. I won't really go too much into his history, just want to talk about the importance of his book about the Underground Railroad. These are two different editions, 1872 edition on the right, 1883 on the left. And there are the title pages, so you'll see sold only by subscription, the 1883 edition self-published. The Clements has a lot of material related to subscription publishing in the 19th century. We have a prospectus for this book, which is what sales agents would take around and try to get people to decide to buy it. So it's a great place to understand the publishing context for some of the work that was coming out about the Underground Railroad. And this is the frontispiece, William Still. And then on another page in the book, his brother and his mother. And I assume a lot of you know his family history. His mother escaped from enslavement several times, made it to Philadelphia, left two of her children behind. His brother, Peter, manages to find him in Philadelphia after 40 years. And William sort of initiated the search to try to find his missing brother. So, it underscores the fact that for Still, this was not just a movement effort, it was a family concern as well, and deeply, deeply personal. But what's important about Still's book, and what I think it really sheds light on in the context of the Clements Collections, is when it comes out in 1872, it really establishes the narrative for how people think about the Underground Railroad. And so it includes images of prominent white abolitionists who participated in the cause, but I think the most important thing it does is underscore that it was really the work of black abolitionists, that the Underground Railroad was sort of, the real risks were borne and the real work was done by black people, and you see that throughout the volume. He reproduces runaway ads from newspapers that sort of set the context for how people were thinking about the work of the Underground Railroad, how they understood efforts to capture people who were fleeing from slavery. And these also show that enslavers knew that the railroad existed and understood where people might try to go, and can help shed some light on 19th century understandings of how the Underground Railroad functioned. But for me, the most important thing about Still's book is the way that it sets the visual landscape of the Underground Railroad. So it's all of the editions of his book are really rich in illustrations that really shape how people came to think the Underground Railroad functioned, how it worked in their imagination. So Here's the famous moment when Jane Johnson and her children are taken off of a steamboat in Philadelphia just before they're about to be taken to Nicaragua. Passmore Williamson shows up to pull them off of the steamboat. So the Clements is a great collection of images of 19th century steamboats. So to understand this incident and how it worked, it's really important to understand steamboat travel in the 19th century. We've got great resources for that. Another sort of iconic scene, people coming off boats in the dead of night to get on carriages to be taken away to head north. Again, we have lots of great material about 19th century transportation of all kinds. This really shows the extent to which the Underground Railroad depended on black activism. You know, this is not white abolitionists showing up in this barn to help get these people free. This is activism from the black community. And so again, this really sets the visual framework for how people understood the Underground Railroad worked. We have lots of other visual materials in the collection that will help sort of situate images like this in a larger visual context. Same thing here with people escaping in a small sailboat. We've got wonderful resources for understanding the coastal shipping trade in the 19th century. Again, helping people put this in context. And this crossing the river on horseback in the middle of the night image. Again, drawing on some of the images that would have been familiar to people from Uncle Tom's Cabin, but also really helping people create an image of how people thought about the Underground Railroad, even though when you read the narratives that people wrote about their experiences, most of what they're doing is waiting. They're hiding somewhere, waiting to go to the next place. That's not what shows up in these images. So it just shows how important Still's work is in shaping that. Sort of one of the famous incidents of somebody mailing themselves to freedom, which is a really famous trope that shows up. And then this, which is, I think, one of the great portraits of 19th century visual culture, Anna Maria Weems, dressed as a young man to escape from slavery. She maintained this disguise for 6 weeks as she fled from Maryland to Canada. I can't look at that picture enough. I absolutely love it. So that's just a sense of how one source can sort of spin out into the Clements collections and how we have materials that can help shape understanding of the Underground Railroad in context. And I'm going to turn things over to Cheney, who's going to talk about our manuscript holdings.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, and thank you very much for letting me be part of this conversation today. I look forward to sharing a few words about the Clements Library's history of acquiring manuscript, handwritten source materials on the subject of African American history, particularly related to abolitionism and the Underground Railroad, before introducing you briefly to a few specific collections. Some of you may already be familiar with a couple of the collections that I'll be discussing, but at least one should be entirely new to you. And as you know, being secretive and illegal operations, railroad activities tended to produce little contemporary paperwork, and manuscript documentation is relatively scarce. However, the Clements Library's handwritten collections include some very significant exceptions. It was only after Mr. Clements' death in 1934 that our first director, Dr. Randolph Adams, worked with the University of Michigan professor Dwight Dumond to obtain our most significant abolitionist collections, which were donated directly by grandchildren of the activists. The papers of Angelina and Sarah Grimke and Theodore Weld, the papers of James Burney, and later papers of Owen Lovejoy, and others. And Paul mentioned the Weldon-Grimke family papers earlier, but we've continued to acquire manuscripts documenting aspects of African American history and, when possible, papers pertinent to Underground Railroad activity. Now, as many or all of you know, the Michigan State Anti-Slavery Society was the abolitionist organization in Michigan in the 1830s and 40s. This is the organization that was established in Ann Arbor in 1836. One of its leaders was James Birney, who utilized support of the society for U.S. presidential nominations in 1840, 1844, under the banner of the Liberty Party. However, as the Liberty Party gave way to the Free Soil Party in the late 1840s and early 1850s, the Michigan State Anti-Slavery Society became less active, and Michigan activists needed a new organization. Enter Harriet DeGarmo Fuller and her husband, Edwin, and other veteran Michigan abolitionists. They met in Adrian, Michigan in the fall of 1853 and formed the Michigan Anti-Slavery Society, based on Garrisonian principles and acting on deeply held moral beliefs. 4 handwritten volumes recording activities of these Michigan anti-slavery societies passed down through the family of Harriet Fuller, who served as recording secretary towards in the later years of the society's existence. And ultimately, a descendant, Bob Travis, donated them to the William Clements Library in 1996. Now, these 4 volumes include documentation of the final year of the Michigan State Anti-Slavery Society in the form of resolutions and minutes of the State Central Committee from 1852 to 53. Member Edwin Fuller retained the records. 3 of the volumes document the birth of the Michigan Anti-Slavery Society from the Constitution and bylaws approved on October 22nd of 1853, through its monthly meeting minutes and annual resolutions, and in its financial records. Most prominent in the financial records are the names of individuals, lengthy lists of individuals donating or pledging money to the organization. Breakdowns of expenses for anti-slavery fairs at Adrian, Fairfield, Battle Creek, Livonia, and other cities are present. And you'll also find prominent individuals and well-known names in these volumes, including Abby Kelly Foster and, again, Laura Haviland. Now, the Fuller papers have been regularly utilized by scholars and, were valuable source materials for works such as Martha Jones' All Bound Up Together, Stacey Robertson's Hearts Beating for Liberty, Carol Mull's The Underground Railroad in Michigan, and many others. One exciting aspect of this collection is that we've recently digitized it entirely, and it is freely available through the Clements Library's website. It's also in the process of being transcribed, which hopefully will further increase, access to the materials, especially to folks who, have trouble with reading the handwriting. Now, the town of Rochester, New York, was a commercial hub with a diverse population and abolitionist leanings. Its proximity to Lake Ontario, about 70 miles east of the Canadian border, made it an important Underground Railroad hub near the end of a fugitive slave's trek out of the country. The Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Sewing Society formed in 1852. In short, in practice, the society's purpose was to raise funds to help support anti-slavery activities. The society held annual festivals and bazaars at which they would sell items sewn or made locally, or items donated by other anti-slavery societies as far away as Cork, Belfast, Manchester, and Birmingham in Great Britain. The fairs had entrance fees, charged for refreshments, and sold books. Now, in the mid-1850s, the Society began a winter lecture series bringing in famous speakers such as Frederick Douglass, Henry Ward Beecher, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, in 1852, their first year, they made $408.57. but by the end of the decade, they brought in over $1,500 annually. So what exactly did the society do with the revenue? One of its primary beneficiaries was Frederick Douglass. Rochester is, of course, where Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany edited the newspaper, the North Star. In the early years of the society, over half of its earnings went to helping keep the North Star solvent. They also paid for the publication and distribution of other anti-slavery literature, provided funding for freedmen's schools, and gave direct financial support to fugitive slaves escaping north on the Underground Railroad. By 1857, the society developed a connection with Harriet Tubman and began to contribute funds directly to her. Well, as the Civil War approached, society activities slowed down and public attention focused heavily on secession, and abolitionism became even more divisive than it had before. However, reinvigorated by the onset of war, the society then devoted the greater part of their energy to assisting the large numbers of freedmen, self-emancipated, formerly enslaved persons, and contrabands who'd come into Union lines. Following the war, the society fairly rapidly dissolved as the U.S. Freedmen's Bureau became a primary source of funding and support for the millions of African Americans who gained their freedom. The final annual report of the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society was printed in 1868. Now, the William Clements Library Associates purchased a collection of the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society papers for $12,500 in 1983 from a rare book and manuscript dealer out of Cazenovia, New York. They are housed in 2 boxes, with each manuscript laid inside a single folder. A significant portion of the papers are routine letters and notes respecting the acquisition and dispersal of funds. Other items are not so routine, such as a letter written by Moses Anderson, an African-American man, an anti-slavery activist who lived with his family in Greencastle, Pennsylvania, not far from the border with Maryland, a slave state. Among the most compelling items in the collection are 9 letters by Frederick Douglass, most of them letters of introduction and requests for assistance to specific fugitive slaves fleeing north to Canada. Now, documents like these are astounding for many reasons, perhaps the most astounding being that they exist at all. The Underground Railroad, as mentioned, was a clandestine network, and by the fugitive slave law, harboring or assisting escaped enslaved persons in their flight to freedom was illegal. And these documents are not reflections or memoirs on Underground Railroad activity produced after the fact. They are transactional items that were produced in the course of assisting men and women on the last leg of their movement to Canada. They were physically carried by escaped formerly enslaved persons, at least across the town from the North Star offices to Secretary of the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, Maria Porter. It's remarkable that the society did not destroy this paperwork upon receipt. They preserved them deliberately, certainly, and miraculously they survived to the present. We'll have examples of these papers on display at the Clements Library later today. And the collection's filled with much more content on Harriet Jacobs, much more. But for the sake of time, I'll move on, except to say that this collection also has been digitized completely and made freely available online, along with transcriptions, which are already available. Very, very quickly, I do want to note that we have quite a number of manuscript collections of Underground Railroad activists, such as Ohio surgeon and agricultural educator, railroad wagoner Norton Strange Townsend. Many of these papers don't have contemporary manuscript material pertinent to their activities. But I'll be happy to speak with anyone later today about any of these collections. I'd now like to introduce a newly discovered collection and please be aware that I will briefly mention sexual violence without descriptive or detailed content. In seeking out new primary sources, we try to expand the sort of inquiries that can be asked of our materials. And one area that we seek to improve our support is the area of legal scholarship. And so, a little over a year ago, the Clements Library had the opportunity to purchase a small collection of 24 documents from between 1848 and 1849 that we've named after the court case to which they're related, the state of Indiana versus Luther A. Donnell, that took place in Decatur County, Indiana Circuit Court. The case has some complexities, but I'll try to offer a sort of brief overview here. A woman named Caroline lived in slavery in Trimble County, Kentucky, on the Ohio River between Cincinnati and Louisville. Now, according to Caroline's sister Mary, the enslaver, George Ray, had repeatedly raped Caroline and fathered 5 of her children. In 1847, Caroline, pregnant with her 5th child, took her other children and fled north over the Ohio River and made her way about 60 miles to Decatur County, Indiana, with the assistance of multiple Underground Railroad conductors. On November 1st of 1847, local abolitionists, including a farmer named Luther A. Donnell, sought assistance from the African American community at Clarksburg to help the family reach the free black settlement there. Meanwhile, a local slave catcher and friend of Caroline's enslaver, a man named Woodson Clark, had discovered the location of the family and forcibly captured and imprisoned them in a fodder house on Clark's son's property. Black abolitionists reached out to Luther Donnell, who immediately sought a local writ of habeas corpus in order to exploit a state law that would essentially make Donnell the so-called owner of the family. The idea being that using local law, they could secure Caroline and her children and spirit them northward before George Ray or Woodson Clark could file paperwork for a federal fugitive slave case. So by November 3rd of 1847, Luther Donnell had signed a writ of habeas, had received a signed writ of habeas corpus and went with a local constable to take possession of the family. But they were not found on Woodson Clark's property. The black community, in the meantime, tracked down the location of Caroline and her kids on Clark's son's property and broke them out of the fodder house where they were imprisoned. With the help of Luther Donnell and his brother Thomas and African-American abolitionists, the family made their way up through Indiana, then through Michigan and across the Detroit River to Sandwich, Canada, now part of Windsor. Now, with the family safe, the plot thickened in Indiana. Luther Donnell was arrested and charged by the state for assisting Caroline's family's escape. He was indicted on 5 charges and found guilty. The case was appealed to the Indiana Supreme Court. Now, this is an important point. Donnell's defense used a precedent set in a case Prigg versus Pennsylvania in establishing that state law regarding recovery of slaves was unconstitutional. This precedent was supposed to serve slaveholders, to shelter them from anti-slavery state laws, but in this case it was used to overturn 4 of the 5 indictments against Donnell. That's a sort of hurried story of a much more complex story, but it's just to say that the Clements Library obtained the local 1848 to 1849 case witness summons, witness testimonies, a summation of the trial proceedings in a grand jury indictment, as well as a verdict slip. And thus far, they've been consulted by a graduate law student, but offer content on black abolitionists and their activities, first-person testimonies to Underground Railroad activity, and more. Now, as a side note, Clements Library staff member Sarah Quashney tracked Caroline down through the writings, again, of Laura Haviland, securing the knowledge that Caroline had changed her name to Rachel Beach on her arrival in Canada, allowing us to sort of set the stage for new research into her life. Caroline, or Rachel, delivered her 5th child after arriving in Canada naming her son Luther Donald Beach. I will end here, but truly look forward to seeing you later at the Clements, and any of you at any time, if we don't have the opportunity to meet later, please always feel free to reach out to me, Cheney Schopieray, curator of manuscripts. I'd be delighted to assist you with any queries that you may have about our collections. So, thank you.
So I just want to say a little bit about how you can come use these great materials that you've heard about. The Clements is open for research right now by appointment only, but to anybody. You don't have to be from the University of Michigan community. Monday through Friday, 9 to 4:30. Please come make use of the materials. You need to make an appointment in advance and tell folks what you want to look at so that we can pull materials. But we would love to see all of you in the reading room. I also want to tell you about our fellowship program. So we award around 20 visiting research fellowships every year for people to come to the library and use materials. Those fellowships are open to public historians, people at museums, historical societies. We don't get enough good applications from people working on slavery and abolition in the 19th century, given the richness of our holdings. We give maybe, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've given one fellowship a year for people working on post-1825 abolitionist topics. I would like to get more applications in that area. I would like for us to make more awards so that more people can write scholarship using our collections, which will spread the word, and hopefully we'll get even more applications. So please, if you know people who are working on projects that would make use of the Clements Collections, tell them about the library, tell them about our fellowship program. If they have questions about applying, tell them to get in touch with me. We would love to see people doing more work on this in the reading room. Thanks.